Okay folks, I think we'll make a start. Thank you all very much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matthew Jarron, I'm the museum curator here at the university. And hopefully you've all had a chance to see the exhibition that we have upstairs called Let's Go Round Again, which features artists and designers who are all at Duncan of Jordanstone from 68 to 72. And so we're delighted to have 5 of them here, and also a couple in the audience who are going to heckle, I think, throughout the proceedings. So I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves to kick off. But first of all, I should also pass on apologies from Callum Strathy, who was going to be part of our panel this evening. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to be here tonight. But I should say, if you check out our YouTube channel, you'll see a fantastic video that he's made where he talks about his time at the college and what he's done since, while making a pot, which is really impressive. So do check that out. That's really good. So let's kick off, and what I'll do is I'll ask each of you to just introduce yourself, say what you specialised in when you were at the college, and then briefly outline what you've been doing since then, if it is possible to do briefly. So Bart, let's start with you.
I'm Bart Biagini. I specialised in drawing and painting at the art school. At the end of the 4th year, I was fortunate to get a postgraduate year at Duncan of Jordanstone, and then I was awarded a Ron Bonner travelling scholarship. So I went into teaching a little bit later, and I had a number of promoted posts in Glasgow schools, and then I ended up an art advisor in Ayrshire, which at that time was part of Strathclyde Regional Council. I was then seconded into the directorate in Renfrewshire, and subsequent to that took up a national post as one of Her Majesty's Inspector of Education, which I did for 10 years. And I shared responsibility with Gillis Campbell. If any of you taught in this part of the world who know Gillis, he and I shared the responsibility for art and design. Having done that after 10 years, I then went back into a local authority as a deputy director, and my job was to try and integrate early years provision through the phases to tertiary education as a head of learning community, and that was in South Lanarkshire Council. And then on taking early retirement, I set up my own company, and I did international consultancy work in education, and I worked mainly across the UAE and then latterly in the Cayman Islands, and for the last 2 years I've started painting again.
Excellent, thank you. Chris?
I'm Chris Treweek, and I studied printed and woven textiles, and I had to make a choice between doing graphics and doing textiles. And I think what swung it in the end was I wasn't sure about graphics because it was advertising and all these horrible commercial things, and it was 1968, and that was not sort of cool at the time really. So I did textiles, and what I think I loved the most was the screen printing part of it. And my first job, I worked for a community arts project and realised that you could use printing as a kind of community activity. And I set up one of the first community print shops in London in the 70s. And from that, I kind of realised graphics did interest me more than textiles, and I went and did a postgraduate year at St Martin's and moved more into freelance graphic design, mostly for kind of clients who were voluntary organisations and charities. So it was quite nice because it was sort of teaching in a way, because they were clients who had bought design before. And I think that's what made me think maybe I quite would like to teach. And when I was 40, I took my first job teaching on a graphic design course and moved to Cornwall to teach at Falmouth School of Art, where I was for 10 years. And then various politics went on in the art school, as they do, and I left and went to Nottingham-Trent and worked in a much bigger university, which was an interesting contrast, really. But I definitely moved into education and into design. And when I retired, I suddenly remembered about my sewing machine, and I started doing machine embroidery and textile work again. And that's what I've been doing, and my recent piece upstairs is from that. Although for some reason lately I've started painting again, which I never thought I was any good at, so that's going to be interesting. We'll see what happens. But I think the thing that happened to me of moving between different sectors, because we've done this 2-year general course, I sort of felt a bit confident across a lot of things. And I was really disappointed to read upstairs that changed and became 1 year and 3. I always thought it carried on in Scotland being 2 and 2. because I was probably the only English person here at that time.
Or totally English person.
Yeah. I was here because my family moved to Dundee, my dad got a job here, and then he decided to leave that job, and they went back to Cornwall and left me in Dundee for 4 years. So I've just come from Cornwall again, which is the first time for 50 years I've done that. So.
Well, delighted to have you.
Yeah, it's great.
David.
Well, I'm David Mcfarland, and I started, in fact, in the architecture department, doing interior design. It was a sort of architectural course for people who couldn't get their O-level language that you needed for architecture. But it was, for the first year, it was the same as town planning, architecture, and interior design. And one day in December, we were taking a college trip to Cumbernauld, which was a new town, and New Lanark, which was indeed an old town, an 18th century Robert Owen built community. And the general idea was that this Cumbernauld was fantastic, this is the way ahead. And I thought, I really like New Lanark. And so, on the spur of the moment, went back to the college and asked to change course. It was, as Chris said, 1968, and the fine art department seemed a lot cooler than architecture.
It was.
It was, particularly with my colleague here. And so I specialised in drawing and painting, which I very much enjoyed. I had a disastrous year at teacher training college, and so teaching wasn't to be a future for me. So I went down to London with a letter of introduction from one of our tutors. Can we get into tutors? Or
We'll come back to Patrick later, yes.
Okay, but that's tutor, that's the word. But anyway, I had a letter of introduction to a gallery, very posh gallery. And I was not a success. I was far too hairy and Scottish. But in Boldens, I went across the road and into Sotheby's, the auction house. And I said, I'm looking for a job, to this impossibly cruel-looking girl behind the reception. And instead of just calling security and having me thrown out, she very kindly called the works manager. He dealt with all the blue-collar workers, porters, lifters, carriers, movers of the place. And he came and interviewed me. He said, do you know anything about Japanese? Second tutor plug. Because one of our pottery teacher at Dundee was a George Shanks, and he had been to Japan, to Mashiko kilns, to work with Shoji Hamada. I knew the words Shoji Hamada. And if you know a little bit about Japanese art in these days, you knew an awful lot more than anybody else applying for the job. So they said, can you start on Monday? And I did. I worked for 20 years in Sotheby's, specialising in Japanese art, not the language. Still didn't get my O-level. But after 20 years, you need to turn around again. And so, against all advice, I gave up the day job and went to Greece to paint full-time with my wife. And that's what we've been doing until Brexit in the last few years. We've been most of our time in Greece. Now we're 50-50. It's been an enjoyable career. There we are. Still doing it.
Still doing it. Still going on,
Annie.
Hi, well, I'm Anne Skinner, and I was at Duncan Jordanstone the same years, although I did a year previously, and did drawing and painting. And when I left, the traditional route, mainly for people who'd done drawing and painting, was to go into teaching. So I did the years, teacher training. I taught in schools for a few years, and after I had my first daughter, managed to do lots of part-time work. In fact, I did actually have a job at Duncan Jordanstone teaching layout for some reason in graphics, not in the graphics department, in the domestic science, I think it was. or home economics it might have been, it was something like that. So I did a bit of work in there. So that gave me a little bit on my CV that I could say was lecturer. So emboldened like Dave, I saw an advert in the Courier for lecturer for Kingsway Technical College, a lecturer in art and design for hairdressers. And I thought, well, there you go, I could manage that. I'm sure I can. So off I went and I got the job. So I did that for a little bit, and it was all just, you know, a few hours here and a few hours there, because I couldn't work full time because I had a young daughter. But eventually that CV sort of built up, and I got a job at Dundee College after 2 or 3 years of doing fixed term and temporary work. And then I was there for 27 years. I did various roles, taught various things over a broad spectrum, became a manager, and was in charge of the portfolio and the fine art and illustration. Decided I didn't really like management greatly. I enjoyed being a facilitator, but it took me away from the art. So I decided I wanted to go back into the classroom, cut my hours and concentrate on my painting. And as a parallel career, I've really been doing my painting all the time. I've never actually stopped doing it. Sometimes, you know, intermittently, but have always done it all the time. So, and I still do it yet. So there you go.
Thank you. Janet.
Hello, I'm Janet Todd, and I again did drawing and painting at Duncan of Jordanstone, and did the teaching year once I left. But I knew I wanted to keep painting, so I applied to, I was a visiting art teacher to 3 schools in Angus, and at the same time I was working on a portfolio, and I applied to the British Council for an international scholarship. And I went to study painting at Belgrade University in Yugoslavia when Tito was still alive. When I finished that, that was a year's course, I did the hippie trail and went around India and Afghanistan and places you can't go now, and Iran. Iran was beautiful. Came back, and my parents had moved by that, well, when I was studying, my parents moved down to just outside Newcastle. So I went home to Newcastle and was out shopping with my mum one day, and she said, there's a wee art centre, we must pop in and see if they'd like to show your paintings. So went in there. Long story short, they offered me a job, so I was the PR and the exhibitions officer for that. Through working at that art centre, I met a lawyer called Henry Lydiot, who was setting up an organisation called Art Law in London, and he said to me, would you like to apply for the job of Administrator of Art Law? So I ended up in London. All the time working on my own work as well. I've always worked part-time as well as full-time. Art Law was funded by the Arts Council of Great Britain for a while, and then the funding dried up. I actually did a slight deviation and went to work for the Mental Health Foundation for 4 years, again in PR and publicity, and I did research for a book called Someone to Talk To, looking at all the agencies in the 1980s who, if you were suffering from depression, you could go to. But I then wanted to get back into the arts. So the Mental Health Foundation didn't really, wasn't doing it for me totally. And but this time the lawyers that I knew at Art Law had set up, and I was involved in the committee for it. They set up something called the Design and Artist Copyright Society, which looks after, and it's still there, it looks after the copyright and rights of visual artists and deceased artists, because your rights as an artist last for 70 years after you're deceased, and you pass it on. And I worked part-time with them in various roles for over 30 years. At the same time, I've always had my studio and showing work, and I'm still doing that. Yeah, so still painting.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So, I mean, it's great to hear this whole range of different careers and experiences that you've all had. We did a similar event last month, which I think some of you came to for a Dundee Women's Festival, and I asked far too many questions at that. We didn't have time for the audience to ask questions, so this time I'm going to ask fewer questions so that you'll all have a chance to grill our various panellists as well. But I just wanted to kick off then by obviously talking about, and Chris, you mentioned the importance of the general course, and just to maybe get you to speak about your experiences of that and the different the range of subjects that were taught on the general course and the particular tutors that you were introduced to. So I don't know who would like to kick off. Let's come back to you, Bart.
Okay. To me, the general course was the key in my development. I mean, basically, we all came from a disparate background. And particularly in the 60s, there was no curriculum in schools, unless you sat the O grade, and then you basically had a very tight curriculum. So you were really the result of whatever your teacher chose to teach. And it was something that, when I first came to the art school, I really did resent drawing boxes and cones and poor Dick Hunter trying to be enthusiastic about analytical drawing. And then it actually clicked that what they were doing is they were developing your capacity to deconstruct objects, to actually synthesize visually, and to develop an analytical skill, which is a cerebral skill. And then, similarly, you had all these subjects that you had to do. Some of them you had to be dragged your teeth to do them because it took you out your comfort zone. And I was absolutely useless at half of them. But the main thing that taught me when I went on to my career as an educationalist was that what they were really developing in the art school was a set of vocabulary. That we weren't dealing with a subject, we were dealing with a language. And the entirety of an art experience is a language in its various forms. And the grounding of that language was drawing. The emphasis on analytical drawing and anatomical work and the rest of it. And then, as a teacher, when I started teaching, somebody gave me a key and said, get into your room, get on with it. There was no curriculum. I insisted from day one that my kids had an entitlement whether they were going to do O grade or not. Remember, in those days, only 30% of a school population sat in O grade. And it may only be one O grade, never mind a composite, a grouping of O grades. And only about 5% on to do higher, and only about 2% on to tertiary education. So starting in the 70s, I was determined, and that was one of the reasons why I got promoted quickly, is that we were going to do a whole range of subjects. And every child was going to have an entitlement because it's part of our language. And that, I would not have had the confidence to do that if it hadn't been for both the general course and the patience of some of the tutors who put up with some of the work that they produced.
I would agree with that, yeah, definitely. I mean, the structure that we were given, there was a lecturer called Jimmy Duff, and we had to do 3 sheets of tracing paper, I think it was, and there was the skeleton, and then the muscles, and then the figure on the top, and that was absolutely brilliant because it gave you a real good grounding and understanding. And then we would go to Bill Cadenhead's class afterwards and talk about the muscles and various things, and you could actually, then it would be pointed out to you, and then you could refer back to your drawing. So there was a great understanding of actually how the figure worked, that you didn't have bananas for arms. You were able to explain that whole structure. And I found that really useful when I went into teaching and education, particularly teaching life drawing, and it was something that was brought in then as well as a fundamental. But I think it makes you look and see in a way that you don't if someone just says, copy a photograph. Because if you copy just a photograph, you're just copying someone else's vision. And it's, photographs are really good as aids. But I think if you're looking at something yourself, you will understand it better, and you see things that the camera doesn't see or that you choose to see. So I found it very useful, that education.
Do you know, I've wiped that out of my memory absolutely. I don't remember doing that at all.
I love that.
What was the name of the guy who taught anatomy?
Jimmy Duff.
That was Jimmy Duff, wasn't
Yes.
it? He
Yes.
illustrated an edition of Grey's Anatomy.
I think he did.
Yes.
He was really, he was really
Before,
knowledgeable.
life wasn't completely rosy all the time. I remember the trepidation of waiting for my first nude model. Do you remember that? And we were grouped alphabetically, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right.
the Valentines of this world and the Biaginis and all the rest were in one group, and we were sitting there and everybody was trying to be really cool. And all the boys had sharpened their pencils, so it was a 9-foot lead and a 2-inch stub of wood. And then the lady came, and it transpired that she wrestled out of Blair Gowrie under the name of Naughty Nancy.
That's right. She did.
And she came in with an Indian blanket akimbo across her shoulders, kicked a heater over towards some little boy who was already turned to a pile of lard with the sweat coming off him, and said, "Ken, give me 20 minutes and never move that heater." That was, I mean, how he could draw after that, I really
Once
don't
we'd
know.
finish up halfway through the drawing, you'd start to realise that these red stripes.
Yes.
On the
That's
body.
right. The bars and the two
Yeah.
lines. That's right. Definitely.
So it was a psychological experience as well as a...
Yes, that's right.
There was one thing I really hated that we had to do, which was called low relief sculpture. Do you know?
Oh, yes.
Bas-relief. Bas-relief, B-A-S, wasn't it?
B-A-S. And you had to
Bas-relief.
do, it was like making a tile.
Stations of the Cross.
Yeah, and it was
Yeah.
like making a tile
Yeah.
with just, I just never understood
We
it
were
at all.
talking in the pub earlier on. John Shanks is one of the students at the time who did the Stations of the Cross. And he did actually get thrown out for it, but it was a wonderful conceptual piece of work, and had it been 40 years later, he would have been given, the
Is it a
scholarship.
bit rude?
No, not at all. It was beautifully made, flat terracotta plaque with a tiny pimple on it. And then the next stage was another plaque with slightly larger pimple
Oh,
and
dear.
it grew slightly up.
We've got first for that now.
And it went all the way up to, it was a nose.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, okay.
And it was
Slowly
just
coming. I never
Station
understood
of
it anyway.
Christ's nose moving on the road to Calvary.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
It didn't go down well, but it's a very exciting thing. I mean, I don't think you would normally do sculpture. I wouldn't normally have done pottery, but the general course, the beauty was you had to go and
had
have
to
a
do
go
it.
at
Well, you
screen
had to
printing.
do them,
Yeah.
and it was all traditional skills really. I would say, and you got a book. You had to make a book on texture. I remember making a book on texture and squeezing out all sorts of stuff, and there was all sorts of different things. I mean, I did embroidery, and there was weaving, there was photography,
I did
there was silversmithing.
silversmithing.
Oh, I wasn't very good at that. Yeah,
With
print making. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Do you remember we had to make a perspex box?
Oh,
Oh,
yes,
God.
that was 3D.
And that was the
That was
first time.
3D.
That was the first time I was banned from the technical department because I kept missing the line that I'd scored on the perspex box, and I was stopped by one of the technical assistants when I was down to this size of perspex and trying to run it through
To make it straight.
one of these blades.
Was it Joe Miller?
Yes,
Joe
Joe
Miller.
Miller. And it was like slightly fluorescent colours you got.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you had to put glue on the edges.
Yeah.
And of course that was really hard to
Dripped
do.
everywhere.
And it dripped.
And then he would come and he was so patient. And I remember I forgot to take the chuck out the drill one time, remember? And it bedded itself into the wall of the... So it was the one thing I never really completed out of all the different things that we did.
But at the
think I
time,
still got some
perspex was very
Well, I was going to say that was pretty quick.
Yeah.
Modern,
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like
it was.
traditional skills, but that was
Yeah.
pretty
It
cutting
was. It was the same time as sort of pink blow-up chairs, you know, that type of thing, and the caresses, you know, the white boots and things. You know, so there was a lot
I
of that
remember
about.
being told the perspex was very expensive.
It
So
was.
Yes.
That's why he was in trouble.
I
I
think
know.
we had to pay for it.
Did you?
It was something like
Trouble,
2 and
yeah.
9.
2 and 9.
But I think the 2 years, I know there's financial pressures nowadays and we're into 1 year, but and I don't mean this in a nasty way, but when I was an inspector and I was going in schools, I started to see almost a reversal of what I found out when I was at school as a student. And that is that if you go straight from a school where your teacher is a textile designer, you're going to be working with textile orientated work, or if your teacher is drawing and painting and you're maybe an abstract painter, you'll be dealing with that kind of work. And then you would go straight into the first year, you would opt for a discipline before you've even had the opportunity to be thrown into something completely unrelated that you hadn't actually experienced before.
Yeah,
and that was the beauty of the course.
Of the course, and I think the portfolio that we did at Dundee College, that covered all these basic things. So a lot of the students had quite a good breadth of experience, so that when they went into art college, the people at the art college always used to say they're sort of streets ahead, because they were much more experienced and much more confident with that. I don't know if that happens now than compared to students out from school, you know. So.
Well, I mean, it went from 2 years to 1 in Scotland, and by the time I left teaching in art school, even the foundation year was going.
That's right.
Some kids would do it, or they could apply straight from A level, and some of them were great and it was fine. But for a lot of students, they weren't really quite
they're not,
ready.
I mean, just not mature enough
And
artistically.
you know, it's to do with funding and grants and all of that. But I think the reason that the UK art design education's had such a good reputation for so long probably was because of that whole foundation structure. And whether that will be maintained now with losing that, I don't know. Because, you know,
the other thing,
I mean, the 1 year course is still a very important part of the art college.
Well, that's good, but it's not in England anymore. What the ones who can leapfrog it do, you know, and it's a shame.
Comment of squandering the Perspex collection, and Dorothy, Sheila saying you had to pay for it. I mean, it always struck me slightly odd. At the university, do the chemistry students have to buy their own chemicals? I mean, we have to buy all our own things.
We have to buy everything. And you used the back of it. You used the back of your paper as well, because it was so expensive, wasn't it?
Yeah, or use newsprint, which was really
newsprint. That's right.
But we were very fortunate. We all had grants, and it was.
We did.
Whereas
We
today's student doesn't have that.
No, we were not.
And it was. You know, that was the great thing about it. But yes, you're right.
Yeah, I was always surprised that friends at the university weren't having to, lay out half their grant for the time.
the other thing I would say about the general course, I actually chose to come to Dundee because in my 6th year at school, I only applied to Glasgow School of Art and I was unsuccessful. And I looked at the folio, I realised why I was unsuccessful. And I'd been accepted for university to do history, and at the last minute I decided I wanted to go to an art school. And my parents owned a fish and chip shop in Carry, usual Italian immigrants. So I worked in that for a year, and I got 2 nights off. And in actual fact, Janet and I were talking about it. We probably went to the same night classes in Glasgow,
School of Art,
and didn't know each other. So I built up a portfolio. So I realised what I needed to do then, and I did this with my students. I used to say to them, don't just go with 1 or 2. So I applied to 4 in England and the 4 in Scotland. And I then went and visited Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, etc. And I was actually only turned down by 1, and that was Edinburgh. And the reason why I chose Dundee, partially it was to avoid having to work in a chip shop at night. Partially, but most importantly, because there wasn't a house style. But, Morocco was a great painter, but you didn't paint like Morocco. When you went to Glasgow, I'll get murdered for this because I still live in Glasgow, it was Donaldson. He was such an influence. Phillipson in Edinburgh was such an influence. Glasgow allowed you, Dundee allowed you to develop your own particular aspect. And I think that's vitally important in any tertiary institution, that you don't get a house style.
It says something about Morocco, though, doesn't it? That he was willing to let that go.
Yeah.
But you very rarely saw Alberto.
No.
I mean, he painted in his own studio, and you didn't really see him. I mean, the only time I remember seeing Alberto was when he did a portrait demonstration
Yeah, he
for
did
his
portrait
own.
demonstrations.
And that was it.
which was very-
I saw a lot of them because of the post.
Oh, right, that's
Yeah.
later though. That's
Yes,
not
that
in your
was
first
much
4
later.
years.
And when we were in 4th year, I mean, the one thing about him was he was the most welcoming human being.
Oh, he was,
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
we'll get into the revels later, but I mean, who would have thought you'd get the head of a painting school, would, you know, wear a pokey hat and stand behind a cafe cutout as part of the revels. I mean, he just was open to any kind of interaction with the students, but you didn't technically see him that often, nor did you see Gordon
Unless if you
Cameron
did
a lot.
something that somebody liked, and you might have got taken down to his office
Yes.
to show it off, like moi.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I did. Jack Knox had done some things during the summer, and Jack had said, I really like them. Well, you've got to show Alberto.
Right.
So I went mincing down to show me. Oh, that's really nice. So I thought this was wonderful. And then I was supposed to go back into the class and develop them. But I think I was so overawed that I kind of wasn't quite sure how to develop them from that stage. But that's something as a highlight of my art college career.
When I recklessly gave up the day job and went off to paint, came back about, I did it initially as a 6-month sabbatical, and then came back and had an exhibition in London of Greek landscapes, basically. But somebody came in during one of the viewing and said, "Oh, Morocco." And I happened to be there, and I said, "Well, no, in fact, it's Greece." And he said, "No, dear boy, not the landscape, the painter." That's Morocco's colours.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's an influence there then.
Well, yes, I hadn't
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
realised it myself. But
Yeah.
this lady, in fact, had a small collection of Morocco.
Oh, so we didn't know that.
So
Yeah.
I later discovered.
Yeah, years later, Alberto, I organised a cancer research exhibition in Dundee, maybe about 92 or something, I can't remember the year, and Alberto donated a painting, a little painting, which sold, I think, for £1,500. Quite a few of the lecturers did, so it was in the Bonner Hall, and I think we raised about 11,000–12,000. But he was so good and so generous, because I'd just written to him to say very nicely, would he do that? And I mean, I did see him occasionally around about Dundee. In fact, he did also paint my portrait for a Dundee Art Society thing. Never, but he took it away. He said, "You're not allowed them." So I don't know what happened to it. But he was extremely generous and really very, very courteous as well. He was such a lovely man, wasn't he?
They all were. I mean, you know, when you actually look, you know, Neil Dallas Brown, you know, what a painter he was.
Yeah.
You had, you know, guys who, in their own right,
Yeah, really good
there were
painters.
lots of them. You know,
Jack
Brett
Knox.
Ross,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
The whole Jack Knox. I mean, you know, I mentioned, I think, in the little blurb about the time when we got onto it, when we were talking about the Dundee Young Painter Society, about how Jack got me out of a real potential mess to do with a painting of his that got damaged. But they were very, very generous. The only thing I would say that they weren't always consistently great at was they didn't formally teach you techniques.
No, that's true.
You know, you had Peter Collins in the group that we had, was probably the best of the group. And Jimmy Morrison, who worked mainly with the others, was pretty good at trying to instill some sort of variation of techniques. I mean,
I think you were taught more in design.
yes.
Really, I
Yes.
think probably you were, because you did have to do the embroidery stitches
Yeah.
straight,
Yeah.
etc. You got all the technical stuff.
And in ceramics.
Stuff there, and
I
in
think
ceramics,
that, you know,
yes.
the
In
ceramics.
painting, we learn from each other,
Well, we
pitching
did.
each other's parts.
Well, that's
That's
right.
a nice knee there.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I like
So
that.
that's how it's done. That's right. You did learn from each other, I
Although
think.
we were taken through to Glasgow to buy some pigments.
That was
once.
me.
Oh, was that
And
you?
David.
Did
Oh,
you
I
organise
went-
That was
you
a Dundee
organised
Young
that?
Painter
Oh,
Society.
that's
That's
it.
why we
I
did it.
remember when we did that.
Yeah.
Had to mix their own paint.
Uh-huh,
Yeah.
we-
Yeah.
It was
I
dreadful.
got that from Smith's, which is in Finnieston.
Yeah.
And it was one of the lecturers, I can't remember who it was, said, because I was saying, look, you know, keep going to the art school shop, it's costing a lot of money. You know, what happens if you wanted to use, I read somewhere about using beeswax, and he said, Smiths, you can go down and you can buy powder paint. So I went in and got a whole pile of powder paint. And then David and I put on a little workshop where we were grinding it in the glass, if you remember, and adding a bit of beeswax. And then we started running buses through to Glasgow.
Only with a very small profit margin.
We had no profit margin, it was our cost. And, but that was because we just felt that there wasn't enough real opportunity to develop it. And that's why, you know, I said we're going to mention it later at the Dunedin Paint Society. I might as well mention it just now. I mean, basically, again, we were going into this canteen, and the canteen was so bland. We're in the middle of an art school, and it's grey walls, and we came up with the idea that we should talk to some of the lecturers about borrowing their work. And Jack Knox said, well, a lot of our stuff's actually with the Ricky DeMarco. So he and I go sauntering down to Ricky DeMarco's studio in Edinburgh, have a chat with him, and he said, wouldn't it be a great idea if you give us a loan of all the stuff that's in the basement, and we can put them up in the canteen walls, and we could even do a rotating exhibition. Because nobody really dealt with careers. Nobody dealt with being able to sell yourself or package yourself or develop yourself. And I thought at least we can get some contemporary art up on the walls. So we get this stuff and we put it up in the canteen and all the rest of it. And we're really feeling very proud of ourselves. And then some moron took an indelible pen and wrote some obscenities across the middle of a Jack Knox yellow banana still life. Remember?
Oops.
Right?
Yeah.
And I had to go and say to him, hey, Jack, I think this is going to be my first 5 years' wages, but your painting's damaged. He said, I'll give it to me, I'll repaint it. He says, and Ricky will never know. And it went by. So, and it was a real attempt because, you know, while I loved Macintosh Patrick dearly, you know, we had the previous, you know, we had 40 years of art history, which consisted of Velázquez.
And then
Macintosh Patrick.
It was
Not in that order.
it was started with Velázquez, and then you had Rembrandt, if you remember. Then you had Bruegel, and then you had Macintosh Patrick.
And then you had abstract, which was his slide turned upside down. I'll show you how to do abstract. You can say, and he would. And he would plonk a bit. It was actually quite clever, and I actually used that in my teaching. But we wanted to do design and all sorts of stuff because actually it was quite clever.
And
just taking a piece of something.
Quite generous as well. It was
He
he
was.
who gave me the letter of introduction to the posh gallery in London.
Yeah, no, he was a lovely man as well.
It's a lovely
actually.
guy.
Yeah, I've heard stories that Morocco and Macintosh Patrick had these huge arguments, if any of you remember.
Well, I think we had heard things like that. They were quite different sort of characters, I think, more than anything, you know. So
Morocco's probably not included on Macintosh Patrick's pantheon of
History of art.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
there's
Yeah,
only
probably
room for
wasn't.
half a dozen.
yeah.
Yeah. That was every week.
You were talking about going through to Glasgow to buy pigment and things. Murray and Stuart used to take us through to Glasgow and up to Stonehaven and
down to the borders.
down
We
the
went
bo-
to
yeah.
Bernie Klein, remember?
Yeah.
Bernie Klein?
Yeah, lovely woman.
and well, yeah, we went to the carpet factory and the lino factories, yeah. And so we did get taken in design to a lot of these places, and she was really good at finding places that sold unusual fabrics and unusual things, and so yes, we did quite a bit of that. It used to be quite good from that point of view. So you did understand about buying yarns and bits and pieces. I can't remember, Chris, if you were ever included.
I think I remember going to Gala Shields once.
Yes, that's
to the
right.
carpet, but I
Yeah,
don't
bloody
remember.
uncomfortable
We
van, I
went
remember that.
to the college down there, Gala Shields.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Farm
that's
area.
right. We went down to that.
And, but it was the Bernard Klein shop, I
Yeah.
remember, he had down there.
That's right. We did that. So that, you know, it talks about the diversity that we've we had as students, and it's true, we did.
Absolutely, and
We
great,
took it
they were
all
great
in our
lecturers,
stride.
really. You know, even if you didn't get on with them all.
We had no idea what they were up to.
One story I'm going to have to ask Bart. I remember in the video you recorded, you told a great story about Grant Clifford taking
yes.
a group. Do you want to-
Yeah, this was, Grant came later in our art school career, and of course he was enthusiastic and very sensory person. He was into really getting out there and letting the wind and the air and getting motivated. And he took a group of us over to, he lived out, I can't remember exactly where he lived, but it was out
Auchmithy. He lived in
Auchmithy.
Yeah.
He took us out to his cottage in Auchmithy, and there was about 4 or 5 of us. And we'd had a very splendid evening, I must admit, and a few hostelries getting there. So we arrived in Auchmithy, and I thought we were going to stay in his Button Ben. No, we went to the adjacent cave, and he decided that we were going to spend the evening in the cave because we really had to get one with nature, and the cave was full of bats.
Oh.
Right? So we're sitting in the pitch dark, in the freezing cold, in a cave, and Jim Falls was one of our group, and Jim was always very enthusiastic, and it was lashing rain, I remember, and he started running up and out, in and out of this cave, getting more and more enthusiastic about the whole experience and waving his arms around. And the lightning was cracking up and the rain was coming down, and we were getting a bit more worried. He was getting closer and closer to the edge of this little promontory that was coming out from the cave. And the next morning, of course, the birds are tweeting and the sun's nice and bright, and we walked out and there was a sheer drop of 152. But that was false. I mean, that was Grant Clifford. It was, if you couldn't feel it, touch it, smell it, it wasn't worth doing.
Health and safety would have a thing which was
Yeah.
Well, there
Risk
was
assessment.
no health and safety. We used to have taps down the sink. Or there was a little sort of tin can thing, wasn't there?
Yes.
long-suffering rubber plant that is
Even that crazy event of getting the artist's work in the canteen, there was no even thought of getting insurance.
I was
or
going to say,
anything. You had no guidance like that at all, really, in terms of...
I know, and you just went up ladders to get your painting
Oh,
down.
yeah.
It could be a huge painting, which you would sort of hold and then sort of try to pass down to somebody, and you could have fallen off there quite easily. You would be like,
Put you up on the right.
yes, you did.
Yeah, you got
And then they would steal the ladder.
Yeah, you got hung up, didn't
I
you?
did.
And they all went to the pub.
I did.
Yeah.
Even the same in textiles, we had all sorts of with bulk urea and stuff like that we used to have to put into the dyes, and we used all the dyes and everything. And I remember once going home with a green arm.
Oh, that was great fun, wasn't it?
I remember sitting on the bus, and the poor bus conductor, when I handed out my money to pay him, he says, what's that? You know? And so you never thought anything of it. If you forgot to put your rubber glove on, you ended up with one pink hand and one green hand or whatever.
I think we used to do that actually. People used to just think, I want a pink hand tonight. And I think it was Procy and Dyes, was it not? Or something?
It was Procy and Dyes.
Aye, which
But
is
there was no
nasty
health
stuff.
and safety with it at all.
Same with raku firing in ceramics. You know, I mean, you threw straw in a bin, got your piece of bisque-fired clay, somebody lifted the lid of the bin and you tried to get it in, and inevitably you had no hair left in your arm, and that was just part of doing it.
So we've obviously mentioned quite a few of the drawing and painting tutors. I don't want to leave you out, Chris.
I
You
know.
want to tell us about the textile tutors. And
What I was thinking was there's a photograph upstairs, I think, in the exhibition of taking tea with Jimmy Morrison.
Yes,
so there's
that's
4
right.
of you.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is the specialist groups were so small. I mean, I can't remember how many we would have been in. We
About
6 or 8 or something.
We were 11.
Chrissy White. I do remember going to Chrissy White's flat along the Perth Road one afternoon for tea and cake or something, right? And you guys obviously did it.
Yeah, we went
We
to
went to Jim
Yeah,
Morrison's.
And I just think that's amazing because by the time I was teaching, the year groups when I started teaching, so this would have been 30 years ago, were about 25 in a year group in graphics. By the time I left 20 years later, the year group would have been 120 students.
I think the
So,
intake was 60.
You couldn't do things like that
No.
anymore. You know, you didn't get to know people in the same
No,
way.
I mean, I think the whole year was 60 people, so you knew everybody from the whole college, really, and then of course people then dropped out.
Yeah.
But I think we were maybe, painters were 2 groups of about 11, would that be right?
I think it was 9.
No, it was 9.
I think it was 2 groups
Yeah.
of 9.
2 groups of
The
9.
final 2
The
years.
final,
And we had that studio all to ourselves.
Yeah, the textiles was the same. We were certainly below
We had
10.
about 8, didn't we?
Yeah, and so graphics were like that too.
They were all really, really small.
Yeah.
I mean, I
There
know
were
that
60 in the year.
I know the intake now for the art college, certainly by the time I'd sort of finished teaching, was about 140 in the first year. So it was quite, so you did really get to know people and form these lovely relationships that have lasted all the years. You know?
but also you've got to understand, in the 60s, let's be realistic about it, there was no internet,
No.
there was no mobile phone,
No.
there was no social media. It took you hours to get up to Dundee from anywhere.
Yeah.
So basically you didn't run home at the
It
weekend.
took me 18 hours to get to Cornwall on the train.
Yeah. And so basically we arrived here, and I think it is forever to the great flexibility of the Dundonians that they saw all these strange people occupying the art school
That's right.
and left us to it,
Yeah.
you know. So you were a community. You literally lived, you know, slept, ate as a unit, and that was one of the reasons why we fed ideas off each other, and that was part of the dynamic of it. Also, you didn't really have an opportunity to go into the web and look at, say, a technique or which you could
that's
do
right. You learned
nowadays.
from each other, really.
So you basically really had to rely on what the person in the studio you were with was actually doing.
So that kind of nicely, oh sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it maybe had some relevance, the fact that the art college was not part of the university.
Well, that's right, yes.
Well,
Yeah.
that's another thing, yes.
It
I think
was-
there was quite a lot of animosity, actually,
There was,
at
yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
And because I shared a flat with people who had relationships with people at the university, and so the flat was mostly university students, and they used to, I'd sometimes say, oh, well, I'm at the art school, and they went, really? You don't look like one of them. It was really, yeah, there wasn't a lot of mixing, was there?
Well, they wouldn't let us in the union
No,
bar.
we weren't.
No,
we weren't allowed
You
in.
wouldn't let them in the tab.
That's right.
They wouldn't want to go to the tab.
Well, that neatly brings us on to social life, and I know the tab is a sort of legendary drinking place. If you have any memories of that, anybody?
Yeah, the size of the toilet, it was absolutely minute. And of course the place used to be jam-packed. And of course then you would be trying to get to it, and it was always a huge queue. And if you wanted to wait, you had to wait. But if you didn't, you could go next door to Willie Frew's. But Willie Frew's was the one with the water running down the
Was that another
walls.
pub?
Yes,
The pub next door.
Pub next door.
The only customers they ever got were people going in.
Yes, the hygiene was not good. That's one thing I remember clearly about it.
But Bert was like a legend, you know,
Yeah.
Bert, who worked in the tavern. And we were just talking earlier that he was very protective of the students. So, if, you know, you wouldn't go home for weeks, and if not months. So if your mother and father just appeared on the scene and Bert knew about it, he would, you know, scurry out and have a word with you to make sure that your domicile was clean enough. And
I lived
free
directly
enough.
upstairs from it, on the
Yeah.
first floor immediately, above the Cozy Corner Cafe, which was never open in my time career. So up and one step to the right. And one morning there was a knock on the door, opened the door, and it was Bert. Come up, said, "I came to warn you, your mother's downstairs." She's all right. Tony Gallagher's talking to her at the bar. Tony Gallagher is about the wildest bloke in the art college. Oh no, it's with my mother. So I had to straighten things up very quickly and get down there. And
But you know, pubs then, and I was a bit surprised by this coming from England, I suppose, it was almost like women couldn't go into a pub at that in those days as
Well,
well.
certainly
Or
my
you could go
parents'
into this
time,
little
yes.
room.
The
slide
snug.
the
The
door,
snug.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was actually
People to the
quite
snug.
liberating that here was a pub actually that women could go in.
Yeah,
you know.
that's right.
Because
We're
it
in
was,
fact encouraged.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good sign up. Girls wanted.
But one of the earliest experiences we had at the art school, we arrived, and the then Dundee Young Painter Society, and I was trying to remember who was the chap who was the head of that at the time. What did you?
I'd say Callum Innes.
Yeah,
but not-
it was Callum something, I can't remember. It was a great guy. And we were all invited to this evening entertainment. It was a quadrangle, if you remember. And they had two bands, one at each end. Do you remember that? And it kicked off. And the noise was so loud that the police arrived after about 20 minutes and tried to shut the place down. And what they'd done is the Dundee Young Painter Society had bought barrels of beer, huge big barrels of beer, and they'd put them at the back of each of the closes, I suppose, of these decaying tenements that we all occupied. And they were there for free drink. That was the whole idea. So the police arrive. David, being an erstwhile, advocate of human rights, immediately gets himself embroiled with the police, as did Lois and one or two others, and they get themselves, and the police take everybody away. And this guy says to me, just wait, son. So I'm brand new, I'm standing there, and the place is cleared, and then we rolled 9 barrels of beer up to his flat.
Oh!
And he said, if you've learned anything tonight, you've learned patience. Patience is a virtue.
Very good.
yeah.
And tell me about sort of other extracurricular activities. Were you involved in music or sports or anything else?
It's a big music scene, but we weren't particularly involved.
Do you remember
Callum.
going on to the South African rugby match at Murrayfield? We all got on coaches and went to the anti-apartheid
Yeah.
demonstration.
Oh,
That
we
must
did
have
learn.
been-
Yeah, there was demonstrations and
Well, yeah, there
certainly-
were demonstrations. I went to London, I'm
Yeah.
sure. There was a demonstration.
Well, in '68 there was the
Oh.
outside the American embassy in
Grosvenor
London,
Square.
and there
I
were
think
posters in
Yeah.
the toilets,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the girls' toilets, and around the college,
Uh-huh.
asking, encouraging people to go
Mhm.
down to London for that.
But the guys, a group of guys who were very much into football, and they had a college football team, and there were quite a number of people who used to play music,
Yeah.
and that was very active.
Yeah.
And
well,
then
there was a lot.
because of the
Yeah.
revels,
Yeah.
and it's quite interesting when you think of the revels. The first year that we were in the art school, was it £200 we paid Pink Floyd
Yeah.
to come in
And I slept through Pink Floyd.
I'm going to say you slept with.
Not as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, slept through.
Well,
Yeah.
I'd fallen, I had a wee snooze on the floor, and
Well, it might have been 3 o'clock in the morning.
well, it was
Yeah.
something, and I just remember this.
I've often wondered
noises,
if Pink Floyd remembered that. It must have been early in their careers.
Must have been
Yeah.
very
But I
early.
wondered if
If they ever got over it. As a group.
what was his name who died, who left?
Sid Barrett.
Sid
Barrett
Barrett.
about it.
I often wondered if Sid Barrett was in. Do we have any
He was
information?
definitely in the band at that time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it must
Yeah,
have
it
been.
must have been
Yeah.
Or
there.
when
Must
it
have
was
been
at
there.
the end when he left, and
But we also had the band that turned into the Average White Band.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we had Peter Frampton, didn't we?
Oh yes,
And,
liked him.
You know, yeah.
That's right. Peter Frampton, Dickie and the Cannonballs.
Dickie and the Cannonballs.
Somebody in the
That was the
Rebel
comedy
Rousers.
But that whole Revels thing was just crazy because all the students were
Clifford.
involved in designing sets and things.
Yeah,
You got the tutors would do anything for a laugh, you know.
that's right. And they all had to dress up.
And you were basically, we just took it for granted, who's that band? Yeah. And
But
3
it
years
went,
later,
it went on all night, didn't it?
Yes.
It went on
Yeah.
for
And
a
I
while.
think
There was-
the
there was
middle
a
of the
thing-
night,
Yeah.
I'm sure the dinner
The
ladies,
canteen was
well,
open.
they
That's
were
right.
all up
Canteen,
and
yeah.
served a hot meal in
That's
the middle
right.
of the night,
Canteen was
which is
open.
amazing
Yeah.
when you think about it.
but the sets were incredible because it would have a theme each year.
That's right.
And then everyone would actually create an environment. They did a stagecoach once.
Yeah, that was
Wells
Fargo.
Wells Fargo. And they made Alberto wear a cowboy hat and all
That's
the rest
right.
of it, and cowboy gear.
I can't remember all the scenes.
There was the boshing
Well, I was going to ask you,
machine.
so 68 was the Hieronymus Bosch one.
That-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big Floyd one.
Yeah, I think 67 was the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
There was
Yes,
one,
that's
I
right.
remember
Yeah,
there was
you
one
remember
that
that, Dorothy?
we screen printed eyes in fluorescent colours and put them on boxes that wobbled off the walls, you know, the ones that were spring. I remember helping
I thought that was
them
Pink
on-
Floyd.
Is that what you're
There was one, a whole lot of the college was decorated, including corridors. And,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
and
you
there
got into
was,
the staff suite as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
there was one we decided, myself from Callum, I'm not sure, to do an upside down sort of pastoral scene. So we had plywood cutout sheet, sort of life size, suspended from the ceiling, see, and astroturf ceiling, and walls and fluffy clouds on the ground. The fire department came round on the eve of the rebels, and
Certainly
or in the
wouldn't do that
morning
now.
of the time,
Yeah.
No.
all out.
But tickets were much sought after from the rest of the Dundee population to see if they could get into this sort of experience with all the bands and
So where did the
things.
money come from, the materials to build all the
Yeah,
stuff?
that's
Who
good.
paid for it?
I think it was part of, I always thought it was part of, if you were in third year,
Yeah.
because it was between
Part
your
of it.
second year and
Yeah.
your final year.
It was like a
all the
project.
third years were, it was like a project
Yeah,
across,
that's
you
right.
know, the architecture, and everybody took
That's
part.
right.
Yeah.
That's
You know,
right.
so if you were in third year, you were commandeered.
So what, our third year then, what was the theme that year that would have been? Because I don't know.
Can't remember.
I can't remember. I think that's the year that, with the eyes on the wobbly thing.
Oh,
I
Yes.
I think there was a circus theme one year.
No,
Yeah.
that was, I
Was
don't
it?
remember that.
When did it stop happening? Or does it
Well,
stop?
I've been trying to find this out. Nobody quite remembers. I think it was right at the end of the 70s.
Uh-huh.
Because at one point they put a new floor in where the big hall is, so where the
Yeah.
new general course studios were.
Well, that's
where
right.
now the general course studios
Yeah.
are. So then they didn't have the space to do it. But I think also health and safety was starting to get.
Yeah, because I remember one event, it wasn't the Revels, but it was a build-up to them. I've forgotten his name, was it Gibson? The chap who ended up...
Oh yes, what was
And
his
it-
name?
Bill
Bill
Gibson.
Gibson, he became an air steward.
He
Did.
became an air steward, unfortunately he died.
Yeah.
But basically, he made these metal amulets, and he put
Yeah.
candles on them,
Oh,
right? And he wanted to do fire. You remember the song Fire? And he built a trellis, and he had two of his friends, and the three of them were only wearing very, very neat underwear. And he had the two of them on the top of this wooden plank that was swinging back and forward on the stage. And they had feathers because they were dancing angels. And he's leading about the stage with all these candles lit. And the guys in the audience got a bit more excited, and they were swinging this thing even more excitedly, till the two angels fell off the trellis on top of this rendering of fire. And Tub Clark, who was a football referee, jumped up on the stage and started blowing his whistle to take it off. So that was a kind of, if it gave you a sort of cultural background to what these events were like.
and the lecturers all really took part, and the models would take part as well, because remember Naughty Nancy, or Big Kendra, I think Kendra,
Yeah.
she was, she would do a little dance.
Yeah.
For people and then the lecture, so she would do all her woof woofs and whatever else she had to do, and all the lecturers were fascinated. Yet we'd all seen her, completely stark naked and worked with her for years and years, but she was absolutely fascinating.
I know.
She was.
Willie Watt was as well.
Oh
Well,
yes,
well,
Willie
well,
Watt was.
Yeah, he was.
Well, remember he used to say, put a tissue on it?
Yes, put a tissue on it.
Willie Watt was lovely, and to this day, if something doesn't work, I say put a tissue on it, because you can diffuse the imagery and tone it down. But that was his mantra, put a tissue on it.
But just thinking of all the antics, I mean, this used to go on in the canteen at lunchtime. Our canteen had like a door there and a door there and the serving bit in the middle. And quite regularly, you'd get somebody doing something and walking through.
And just walking through.
What was it? Who was it?
Stan Bonner had
And-
brought in
and
the little
There
hippo.
was a little stuffed hippo that we had. That,
We was into hippos even
There you
then.
go.
Yeah, well that's right. So that's right. I remember this little stuffed hippo, which I think
It
was
a
in the
prop.
college.
It was a pygmy
A little
rhinoceros.
rhinoceros or
Okay.
something.
And it was a prop
Okay.
in the fourth year paintings.
Yeah, that's right. And that got wheeled out, and there would be somebody sitting on it.
And they
so it
just
was-
walked through the canteen. It was like a performance before performances ever
Yeah,
thought to be an arts
Yeah.
thing, you know.
that's right.
And this would happen regularly.
So there was always some sort of entertainment, wasn't there?
So I just wanted to see if anyone in the audience had any questions for
I was actually going to mention something more serious, and that was and I mentioned it actually at our last meeting, and it was about our SRC reps, and Chris was one of our SRC reps, and
Well done.
she single-handedly organised getting a creche started for not only for women that had children, but also for anybody in the place that had children. And she was the very first person to get that up and running. And she used to come into the studio, and the bag would go down. Well, I've had this and that, and it's going to happen. I'm telling you, it's going to happen. And I always thought it was really good, because what it meant was that there were girls who'd had children, and they were really between a rock and a hard place, because they could not necessarily do as much work as they should. But it was actually at that time considered a wee bit strange to run a creche for students.
Well, I think, you know what motivated that? We had somebody in our group
Yes,
who'd had a baby
Yes, that's
and
right.
was, managing this somehow,
Yeah.
and it made it really brought it home.
Yeah.
And my memory is it was in the church over the
That's
road.
right.
Yeah.
It was the church hall.
It took another 40 years before they introduced this in the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah.
But you're right, there was no student welfare
No, absolutely
understanding
not.
at all,
But
really.
that was-
I mean, they were
mental health
very,
welfare.
very caring individuals across the whole of the art school.
Mhm.
But you were under constant pressure because the dropout rate was very high. I mean, you didn't know if you were going to get thrown out or not get thrown out.
Yeah, you could
And-
fail.
There was a lot of repeating the years.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd already told the story of Jack Knox standing behind me and Dennis Buchan, and for the whole of third year they kept, and I'm ripping my paintings up to the point I had hardly anything at the end of the year, and they said, get yourself along to Alberto's room, and I go along, and they said, right, okay, you're getting the Duncan and Duncan Drawing Award. I actually thought I was getting booted out. And, so there was a strange lack of real understanding about, the potential difficulties that some people
think-
might have in individual students.
There's something to be said for the generation of tutors that we had at that time had mostly all gone through the war or had been touched on.
Yeah, there was
Yeah.
quite a few
So,
of them, that's
yes.
right.
Ian Eady.
Ian Eady in particular.
Yes.
Ian Eady,
Beautiful
yeah.
soldier drawings
Yeah.
he did.
Getting upset about some of the things that maybe students got upset about maybe didn't have the same relevance to
Mhm.
what
And
we
Cameron
think
was
of
the
it
same,
now.
wasn't it?
But life was changing, because women were becoming much more equal and expected to have jobs. But it's still taking time. But it was one of the things nowadays. If you were to say to all the students at the university or at art college, no, there's no creche for kids. There's no.
Or no student support, or no hardship funds.
I
or
think interestingly, when
anything.
the art college eventually became part of the university
Yeah.
in the 90s, that was really one of the key
One of the
reasons,
Yes.
because the university had the support, counselling,
Yes,
disability
that's
services
right.
and all that kind of thing.
It was interesting when I went to work at Nottingham Trent, a bigger university following
Yeah.
art school. the School of Art and Design turned out to be the biggest users of student support services. And I always imagine that's because, you know, you're much more exposed when you're making art in a way. I think you're bearing yourself
Sensitive's
much
the
more.
word.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. It might have been because we were over the road from their building, of course, as well. But,
Yeah.
But having said it, they had their own way of counselling. And I remember Gordon Cameron.
I used to get
who was-
hand-painting now.
It was a but Gordon Cameron was a very quiet gentleman. He was a terrific guy. And I was in my third year or fourth year, and you probably notice I'm, you know, not short in saying a few things. And I remember seeing Alberto walking along the corridor, and he was wearing his camel coat. And I used to think I was Billy Connolly, so I made a comment about the fact that Alberto's head was the same tone as his coat, not knowing that Gordon Cameron's standing literally behind me. And you'll see from one of the photographs in there, I was very proud of my mop of hair when I was a young man. And Gordon Cameron went forward and he said, when Alberto and I were your age, he'd a head of hair that would have beaten yours. And he said, enjoy it, because you won't have it very long. And he was right.
I know the feeling.
But
But you know,
that was the way they responded to it. They just diffused things.
it's funny though, you saying that you were always in fear of failing the year, and that the way the colour was, because I can't remember, I don't know if anyone else, having been involved in education, the whole thing now, because you have to say what the assessment criteria are, and you've got to say what the learning objectives are. And I look back and I thought, I don't remember being assessed the whole time.
You were told if you passed or you didn't pass.
And if you didn't pass, you weren't always told at the time.
No, you weren't.
Well, that's why people maybe were frightened of being
I
suddenly told.
I repeated second year, and when I turned up to sign on the dotted line to go into third year, and Jimmy Duff, I was like, oh, where's my name? And he took me aside and we looked through the thing, and that was when I learned
You had to repeat the year.
Oh, for goodness sake.
You see, when you actually think about it, when I first started teaching, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, I turned up in a big secondary school where 90% of the kids were not doing any certification. And I got my key, and that was your room, and you went in, and that was it. You were left on your own. There was no program of study across the department. So if you didn't have that in the schools, and I'm talking about after having gone through art school, you certainly were not going to have it in the art school.
Yeah, you either passed or failed, and I think your name went on a list or something. And it was even when we had to choose our specialist subject.
Yeah.
I remember going in the boardroom, I think it was, with a great big shiny table, and all the lecturers were sitting behind there with doing a bit of paper or something. And then you would just sort of sit, so it was a bit like an inquisition, and they'd say, so what would you like to do? And I went, well, not really, maybe pay. I said, well, they'd all be very happy to have you. What are you going to choose? Whoever, I think it was Andy Taylor that was saying that. I said, I'll do drawing and painting. That was it.
I don't remember that.
I remember that really clearly.
Do you remember that, Bart?
But I also remember my post-it year. I got this extra year, which was fantastic. I was with Derek Souter, I was with Joe Smaniki, I was with Clark, I was with really talented guys, and we were all in the old Valentine cards were, right? And, you know, it's a time to experiment. So Clark was making these moulds of little babies.
They were little babies like
really bizarre.
chickens. Yeah.
And I was painting these big 4 or 5 feet abstract paintings based on the toilets and the Valentine cardboard. They're black and white, William de Kooning type things. And Alberto comes up and he stands there and he looks and he says, I used to think you could paint. And he goes out. And then I thought, damn it, I better actually do something that looks realistic. That's why there's a fish and chip shop. Partly because we were knocking Dundee down at the time, and there was a whole nostalgia about that. But part of it was to actually prove I could actually use a pencil after a year of... But that was just... So even then, and then we had the post-diploma show, and the same thing happened. We didn't know who was getting the Ron Bonner Award, if anybody. And, you know, I just basically got called in. There you are, there's the money, you can go and...
You didn't get told if say for instance it was a painting, that there was something really good about the painting or something really bad about the painting, and how you could bring these two elements together. You didn't get any of that advice. It was either you passed or you failed, and you either liked it yourself or you didn't. It was very rare that a lecturer would come and work or help you with anything.
But that might have just been how it was in those days.
I think it was.
Well, I think so. I think that was across. I think that was.
That's
And it was like that across all the disciplines.
I found some school reports
Yeah.
after my parents died, my school reports, and I hated science at school. And my science, it was chemistry or physics, and I got a bad result. And the comment from the teacher just said, Christine finds this subject very difficult. How do I get better? What am I doing wrong? You didn't get any feedback.
What you didn't get though in Dundee, which was a benefit, was that when I went back to Glasgow, Jordan Hill, for my teacher's training year, the colleagues who had been at Glasgow School of Art, very talented painters, it depended on the lecturer, but the lecturer could pick a paintbrush up and paint on top of their work.
Well, yes,
and that never ever happened to me.
One or two people do that,
And
particularly in drawing.
Did
did you?
I remember doing something delicate and very nice, rare, and then somebody coming up with a big stub of charcoal and going, no, Laddie, the backbone's down there.
Right.
Right, well, maybe on the drawings, but certainly in painting, it was quite, seemingly it was quite common. And, so you end up, you would just put the painting in the bin. But yeah, I mean, it had, my only criticism of it, as I said before, was we could have had more technical input, but certainly we could have had more idea about how real life was going to be for an artist once you
Yeah,
went.
there was no clear advice.
You were not prepared.
In fact,
We all drifted into teaching eventually.
I mean, you put up your diploma show, and if you were lucky, you might have sold a wee picture. But if you didn't, you just then drifted into the college
But I think
education.
that's really
They were
changed. I
toughening
think
you
that's
up.
just the
Yeah.
trousers.
Well,
But that's,
I had no idea that you could,
Yeah.
what you could do when you left.
but that's an interesting one you're saying, Annie,
Yeah.
about selling, because certainly when we finished our fourth year, your paintings did not belong to you. They belonged to the art school.
Well,
You
it's the same.
couldn't
That must be
sign-
what you've got in your
You
archives.
couldn't sign a painting. The result is that when you asked me to look through the archive, because I know that a few things went, I can't remember where they, but I certainly didn't recognise some of the ones that had gone, so I don't know where they ended up. But since we painted the same kind of subject matter up until third year at least,
Yeah.
I couldn't tell the difference. I mean, how many paintings of
Yeah,
a
the
model
same
lying
model,
on
that's right.
ideas. And but there was no question of you selling your work. You weren't allowed to frame your work, if you remember, for long enough.
But
it was only in your
Was it your fourth year then? Because you
Fourth
could got
year.
lathe round
you
it.
could put that's right.
Because I sold some from the diploma show to an architect's wife. Yes, for £5.
Yeah.
We were allowed to frame our embroideries, but I was asked to, someone wanted to buy one of mine, and the manager said, absolutely no way. And of course I
broke the rules,
I
Annie.
thought, well, hey, wait a minute, I thought, I was going to be selling it for about £15. So I embarked on doing one exactly the same. And it was the most, I did it, but oh God, I never did anything like that again. It was dreadful.
But Kate Monteith sold something as well. She sold it to the same architect's wife.
Right.
And then when I realised how much she'd sold hers for, I thought, I was so pleased that somebody wanted it. That was why I said, oh, a £5.
Yeah.
Nobody told me there was value on your art.
Yeah.
You
To
know?
be honest, they still get very little guidance on how to price it.
Yeah.
As we discover
Well, it's
every
up to
year.
yourself,
Yeah.
isn't it? You-
Interestingly, there's an exhibition on in London, in the Barbican at the moment, of post-war British art. It's quite
yeah.
dark, splendid exhibition. And there's a room of 3 big David Hockneys from early times. And they're all property of the Royal College of Art.
So student work.
Yeah. So you bought the materials, you paid for them,
Yes.
and then you had the honour of giving your work over to whoever wanted to pick it up, if they wanted it. But that was life.
But we did a good trade in exchanging things.
Yes, we did.
So I
Yeah.
still have a painting by both
Yeah,
of
got
those
some
on the wall in my house.
Uh-huh.
And Janet's still got a length of my textiles.
Yes.
I don't know what
You
happened.
must have had
I
something.
I must have
with
had some. I probably made it into some sushi.
Yeah. I have a dress.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yes.
So many memories. And I just wonder if you could imagine yourself as a student today in the art college. One regret that they're not going to experience and one that they are going to benefit from that you didn't have.
Well, I think what they have now is much more career advice and much more business-like attitude. I think that's probably one of the biggest differences. I think they've got a lot more freedom, but I think what we had was the structure and the smallness of the groups, and that camaraderie, I think, was actually really, really important, and I'm not sure if that happens quite as much now. I think they're also under very much pressure to become artists before they leave and say that they're artists, whereas I never thought of myself as an artist. I thought of myself as somebody who did art and continued doing art because I loved art, not because I needed, you know, this label or to try and sell it. So I think that's probably one of the biggest differences for me. Yeah, I don't know what everybody else thinks.
Well, it was a wonderful, the late 60s was a wonderful age of irresponsibility in a way. You were given a grant, go there. So there wasn't this pressure on you. I mean, it must be frightening now for students who have to pay a large amount of money, then the pressure's on them. You can't go giving up architecture because you don't like Cumbernauld.
Well, that's very true.
You wouldn't have that sort of freedom. Then, Love and Peace in the late 60s, nobody thought about it.
No, and I suppose that was...
Well, we'll pick something up on the way.
Yeah. But I agree with Annie. I think the key thing is nowadays students, I would hope, look at a far better grounding of their rights, of copyright aspects of it, of how to sell yourself. Because the biggest thing still to this day is, as you say, that we all paint because I've always painted, but I just didn't exhibit after about 86 or 87. And I've only just started going in galleries again. I hate it. I hate taking my work in, and because the person, you spend half your time looking at the gallery thinking, what kind of art do they want, right? Instead of actually going in and saying, that's my work, do you like it or do you not like it? And the gallery owners are driven by square footage. He taught me this. I turned up all these big 6-foot paintings and he said, look, Bart, in London, if you do anything bigger than that, you're probably taking up £1,000 worth of space, And, so these kind of realities are better, I think, discussed with students very early on about the real job, because I know very successful artists who have never been successful commercially, and I know other artists that personally I think maybe I'm not as gifted, who have been extremely successful commercially. And if that's the career you want to go into, then I think that it's a benefit to the students that they actually are helped.
Because I'm just thinking, I do show with quite a few galleries and have done over the years, and you've got galleries take 50%.
They
so
take a lot of your money.
You walk into a gallery, and especially in London where I live, 50% of that goes to the gallery. So if you framed something and it's £250, say, is not an untypical amount of money for a frame, I've got to put 500 on that just to cover my £250. That's without buying the canvas, the paints, and the time,
and
paying the studio rent,
That's
and all the rest of it. If I actually costed it out, I could not afford. No one would buy it. No one would buy it, and you're not told that at art.
No, you're not.
Another real irony is if you've got an exhibition and you have to frame up 20 pictures and you sell 10 pictures, you would say that's a really great exhibition. That's a good success. However, when you come to paying your tax at the end of the year, you are not allowed to claim for framing 20 paintings. You can
Yes,
only,
you are.
Yes, you are.
no you're not, you
Yes,
can
you
only
are.
claim for the, no, it's then, it's
Well,
stock
what
in
have I
hand.
You've been getting
I've been very careful at this point, and maybe rescind from this in case HMRC.
It is called stock in hand, and you cannot claim for the framing of the ones that weren't sold.
Yes, you can.
I mean, not legally.
Yes, you can. And you can offset your losses as an artist against the
your
tax
other-
that you pay as a... that's why I've been having worked part-time all the time. I just happened to meet a very friendly accountant who's helped me through all this. And yeah, you offset, and even as an old age pensioner now, I offset my losses as an artist against potential tax I would pay as a pensioner.
Yeah, you can.
I'll introduce you.
And fascinating the tax discussions are.
We'll visit you in prison, both of you.
Could we end with some kind of final reflections on I guess your experience at the Art College and how you feel it sort of influenced you going forward? Thoughts or?
I just think it was the diversity of the whole experience, and I think one of the things that I desperately wanted a post-dip year, and I didn't get it, and that, having not got it, that just made me so bloody minded that I was going to, I went for the British Council Scholarship, and I went, throughout my life, if an opportunity has arisen, I've taken it.
Yeah.
And I think that's,
yeah,
and I've got wonderful friends.
as well, yeah.
For me, as I said before, I'm just repeating myself. I mean, I came as a very naive young man who thought that art was an activity that you did because you did it at school. At the end of it, I came out the other side knowing that it was a language and it was an entitlement for everybody to develop their own personal approach to it. I took that with me into teaching, and that's why I get heavily involved in curriculum development and standard grade, the bid for City of Culture and the City of Architecture bid I was heavily involved in, because I was driven with this real commitment that every single child, irrespective if they're going to make a career in art or not, and God help us, maybe if the politicians were more aesthetically developed, they wouldn't be making the decisions that some of them were making. And that was the art school that opened that up for me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's one of the things that, one of the most endearing things about it is actually the friendships, because it's, quite unusual. I mean, and having gone into teaching, the art department was always a slightly daft department, and there's sort of a connection between us all that's very different from some of the other departments, and I think it was quite unique with just the size of the groups that we had, and I think that grounding kind of sort of takes you through.
I think that's one of the big things that we had that, and it was only because it was a relatively small group. But I agree with you when, I came along far later than you to Dundee College, and there was that sense of madness at the old Graham Street
that's right.
annex, that we were all in this, all slightly crazy.
Well, that's right, and it was sort of like Art College grown up.
Yeah.
Except when you left the staff room, you had to behave.
But I mean, I was thinking that the funny thing about any higher education really is when you go into it as an 18-year-old, you don't actually know what the journey of your life is going to be. And it's quite interesting, for me, seeing the things I actually ended up doing that I wouldn't have known I was going to do. And I think the breadth of the course, and maybe because we were smaller and I was around other disciplines more.
That's right.
Because I've always felt like I'd roll my sleeves up and have a go at lots of different things really during my life, and I don't know how much that's
insulated bubble in a way, almost the art college separate a little bit from the university, but combined even. They're again separate from the rest of Dundee. And the art college had an atmosphere that wasn't parochial, as I think even friends in Edinburgh and Glasgow, they were always a little bit, we're not in London. Whereas that never really seemed to be an issue in Dundee. We were in Dundee, heard of it, until we left and then wanted to go.
Yeah.
I think it was a very, very special place, and I remember in my teaching when I was doing the portfolio preparation group, I remember what it was like to be 18, and I remember, you know, all these young people and, you know, trying to get the enthusiasm of what it's like to have a career in art, and you could see all the little bright eyes and bushy tails, and to me it was quite a privilege to do that, because I remember clearly how fantastic it was and how much I loved being at the art college and part of that whole culture, and I thought, yeah, it's good to be able to help people in doing that. So
Sounds like
we'd
an
recommend
excellent place to end. I can't really go on for another.
As a career, we would recommend.
I think you'll agree we've had some fantastic stories and lots of great memories and experiences.
It's
So I
nice
think-
anyone wanted to come and hear
No,
about
it's
it.
delighted. So I think a big round of applause for all.
thank you.